Welcome to Tech Week. This is one of the last weeks of the story behind before I officially go on baby break. But this week was planned way back in January when Jim Collison from the Home Gadget Geeks reached out and wanted to do a collaboration of his show and mine. If you haven't listened to the episode of Home Gadget Geeks from Thursday, February 9th yet, there's a link in the show notes. In this episode, I'll be talking about, well, actually, let me have Siri tell you what I'll be talking about.
Emily will be talking about my history, starting with my ancestors, computers that would take up whole rooms with the function of being able to recognize a handful of spoken words, through the technology we know today. Here is your host, Emily Prokop, and this is the story behind voice recognition. But first, a quick message.
If you like this podcast, you might be interested in other podcasts that focus on the humanities. In fact, if you search Twitter for the hashtag Humanities Podcasts, you'll find plenty of shows on history, language, literature, philosophy, art, and more. These are podcasts by people who enjoy telling stories, exploring the arts in our world, and who want to share their knowledge. Some examples of the podcasts you'll find are Myth Take, focusing on Greek mythology, the Feast Podcast, which talks about great meals in history, or The Lonely Palette, an art history podcast. Search hashtag Humanities Podcast today, or follow Humanities Podcasters on Twitter. And if you're a Humanities Podcaster, use the hashtag in your tweets so others can find you. Finding out about the history of voice recognition reminded me a lot of teaching my daughter to speak, a process I get to start all over again pretty soon. And it started with numbers. In 1952, Bell Laboratories developed a machine that could recognize the spoken numbers 0 through 9. This was called Audrey, which was a portmanteau of the words Automatic Digit Recognizer, plus an extra Y at the end just so it would match the common spelling of the name. And it was huge. Literally huge. The relay rack alone was 6 feet tall. Audrey didn't talk back. She responded by flashing lights, and she wouldn't respond to just anyone. In order to maintain the 97% accuracy of the machine, the speaker had to become acquainted with Audrey, and she was constantly fine-tuned and adjusted, all for 10 numbers to be recognized. To take the analogy further of teaching a child to speak being similar to early voice recognition, IBM introduced the shoebox machine at the 1962 World's Fair, which understood a whopping 16 English words. But it was the Department of Defense in the 70s who really advanced the technology of speech recognition. A department called the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, known as DARPA, created Harpy, a voice recognition software that could understand more than 1,000 words. This was a huge beginning step to creating the voice recognition we're familiar with today. But it was still a far cry from what science fiction TV and movies such as Star Trek and Star Wars portrayed at the time. But it was probably those movies that inspired the advancement to machines that could not only understand what we were saying, but respond as well. And because sometimes the 80s are scarier than anything we could have come up with in science fiction, let me introduce you to your new nightmare, Julie, the doll that could respond to your voice.
Grandpa, can she play with me? I like to play. What can we do?
She understands you.
Yeah, it's just as scary as it sounds, but to a kid, it was quite possibly the most magical doll ever. And this was right around the craze of Cabbage Patch Kids, so as you can imagine, doll companies were trying to capitalize on that success, which we talked about in the story behind Cabbage Patch Kids. One thing to note about voice recognition is the machines aren't actually recognizing whole words. They're recognizing the smallest elements of spoken words, known as phonemes, and putting them together within the software to determine what word you're most likely saying. Phonemes are the elements such as vowel sounds or something podcasters are familiar with called plosives like a P or a T sound, which things like pop filters over microphones soften. The software may not always catch every phoneme, nor are they always able to format your speech and translate it to something the computer can understand. Just think of the examples of yelling at Siri for screwing up talk-to-text message. Or, in our house, our Google Home recognizes when my husband says to turn off the living room lights, but not when I say it. In 1990, a company called Dragon introduced the first speech recognition program available to everyday consumers called Dragon Dictate. For the low price of only $9,000, you could talk and have the program type what you were saying. Even as the years progressed and the technology improved and became more affordable, 7 years later, when Dragon Naturally Speaking came out, the program could only recognize 100 words per minute. And you may remember from the story behind Steno Masks that the average rate of speaking is about 163 words per minute. So you would have to talk like this. That was even after the initial setup you needed to go through with the program that took about 45 minutes for it to recognize your voice and speaking patterns. Even at almost $700, it was only 80% accurate. Dragon Dictate is still around, by the way. In fact, going back to science fiction, writer Peter David, known for writing numerous comic books, including Star Trek comic books, began using it in 2012 after his stroke.
Hello, and welcome to Moviefone.
Remember those words? Maybe they bring back memories of finding out what movie to see for date night, or you might remember them from memorable episodes of Seinfeld or Family Guy. Well, you can thank Bell South for introducing the first voice portal called VAL, short for Voice Activated Link, in 1996. This technology could be used over telephone for quote-unquote quick access to information about anything from movie times to restaurant suggestions to troubleshooting and customer service. You could even use it to buy a car. Being able to talk and get spoken word responses was the piece of technology that really astounded us, though. But did you ever notice that many computer voices, such as navigation software, Siri, and the new voice-activated assistants, have mostly female voices? This is actually intentional. Think back to the computers featured in 2001: A Space Odyssey, War Games, or even the autopilot computer voice from WALL-E. It's no wonder we're more comfortable having a female computer voice when movies exacerbated our fears of computers outsmarting humans with menacing male voices. By the way, if you do a Google search for the infamous War Games line of "Shall we play a game?", the first result will be a game of tic-tac-toe you can play with Google. I lost about 5 minutes of research for this episode when I found this little Easter egg. However, one alternative to Google Home and Amazon Echo is voice-controlled software called Home Automated Living, otherwise known as HAL. You would think they would have considered the supercomputer, the HAL 9000, from 2001: A Space Odyssey before picking that nickname. Even though now the voices of voice-activated assistants like Amazon Echo or Google Home are synthesized, there is supposedly a real person behind the voice of Siri. Susan Bennett is a voice actor from Atlanta who took a job in 2005 recording different phrases 4 hours a day for a month for an unknown project from software company Scansoft. When colleagues began playing with Siri in 2011, they recognized her voice and she was just as surprised as they were. Apple will not confirm the voice of Siri, though. Thanks to Jim Collison from theaverageguy.tv for having me on his show, Home Gadget Geeks, back in February to talk about voice recognition and mechanical keyboards, which we'll talk about in the next episode. Information for this episode was sourced from HowStuffWorks.com, PCWorld.com, IBM.com, CNN, and more links which can be found in the show notes at thestorybehindpodcast.com. Follow on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at StoryBehindPod, or subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. Thanks for listening.